Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So much Zoom is happening that I'm just starting to ask everyone if we could just have a moment of silence and just get yourself here. Just bring yourself into this space, this conversation that we're having, and let's just take a moment to do that however it works for you. Gives me an opportunity to mute while the train is going by my house as well. And I just want to thank you all for being here. Today's panel is on racism, COVID-19, and climate change, or our changing climate is how we like to refer to it in the active voice. It's about our duties as media during this election year. And I'm Sally Kane, CEO of the National Federation of Community Broadcasters. I'll moderate today's discussion and try and move myself out of the way because I am surrounded by incredibly talented, insightful panelists here who will lead our discussion. We've had a preliminary conversation, so I have a little peek into what they can offer, and I'm excited for them to share it with you. Our speakers today are media trailblazer Bill Siemering. He's a current fellow at Wincote Foundation, the founder of Developing Radio Partners, the author of NPR's original mission statement, and the first program director who started All Things Considered. Next is Julia Kumari Drapkin. She's CEO of IC Change. Julia, I tried to encapsulate your wonderful, succinct summary of IC Change, even though we worked together on it the first year, but I'll let you do that when you light up the screen. Next, Maxi C. Jackson III. He's Chief Content Officer of New England Public Radio. He's been in the business for decades, treasured colleague and friend, very insightful expert on content and public media space in general. And Carlos Morales, a fearless border and immigration reporter at Marfa Public Radio, who has been winning awards for the work that he's been doing and is here to contribute to the conversation with very much on the ground practical insights for all of you. He's someone doing the work that we're talking about. So before we begin, a few quick announcements. During this conversation, you're encouraged to offer questions in the chat. The sublimely smiling Ernesto freeze frame there indicates that he's monitoring the chat for us and is, the man behind the curtain, as you all know really well, on all of this stuff. And at the conclusion of this event, you'll be directed to a survey. We really appreciate your feedback, listen to it, and that's where you can also share your thoughts with our speakers in the chat box. I see there are 30 people participating, probably more jumping on board, so that's great. Join us also September 9th while we have your attention. Just want to remind you of that. It's a panel on the future of college media with COVID-19 and declining enrollment. That's impacting universities nationwide. So NFCB is teaming up with University Station Alliance, Virginia Dombach there, to host a dialogue on paths forward for university stations. So you can sign up for other updates at nfcb.org about that webinar, and we'll keep you reminded. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted at nfcb.org. Seems like every time we get questions like that, so yes, we will. Yes, we will make that available to you. And without further ado, we're going to jump into really a two-pronged conversation here, which is one, what's the connection between racism, COVID-19, and our changing climate? And two, with regard to being community media stations, what's our role and our duty in covering these stories and in supporting our community? And as you'll see from our panelists, it's pretty multifaceted. So we want to dive into that and really encourage people's candor and encourage your thoughtful listening to these people who are bringing to you a topic that is both vulnerable and urgent. So with that, I'm going to segue to you, Maxi, and hope that you can just kind of ground us in your vision of community media's role at this time of intersectionality with these three crises we face.
Well, thanks, Sally. I appreciate it. And I'm honored to have an opportunity to speak to so many of the good folks who are the membership of NEPM and also to join my colleagues on this panel. When I think of sort of this three-headed monster that we're dealing with on this panel, the notions of COVID, the pandemic itself, racism and climate, what is universal for me is the notion of inequality. It seems to be the through line for all three. And in terms of the role of community media, I have always, and I think I expressed this years ago, I've always believed that the real significance of community media is its ability to serve as a utility to the communities that it serves. We know this to be true with the Native American stations and their preservation of language and culture. And we know this to be true for the urban and rural stations that are amongst the NEPM membership and community media, because of the fact that the information that is often presented through the platforms, whether it be online or through the radio stations, is actually useful information that can actually help people live their lives in a productive, constructive, and resourceful way. And so I think no matter which of these topics you look at, that notion of utility should always be first and foremost with respect to the media that's being created.
Thank you, Maxi. And that provides, I just love when radio people provide segues, because that provides a wonderful segue for me to pivot to you, Bill, and tap some of your wisdom and background about what Maxi's talking about, the role of community media and the connectivity between these three issues and inequality. I think you might be muted, which is a terrible shame. There you go.
So just as an overview, in these times, one crisis erupts after another, it seems like, and we can feel quite overwhelmed, to say the least. So this afternoon, we will be talking about how we're interconnected. And at the same time, Amy Webb of the Future Today Institute said, catastrophes are great catalysts for change. So we could kind of look at this as an opportunity, help design that change, you know? And also one of the things that's happened, taken together, these crises have lifted the large rock, revealing rot that's been there for a long time of all kinds of institutions. We saw failures of our healthcare system, horrific working conditions in meatpacking plants, overcrowded prisons, poorly staffed homes for the elderly, shocking abuse of police against people of color, which is not new to people of color, of course, either. And I think now more Caucasians have become more woke than ever before. So no one's calling for a commission to write a report as they have in other times like this, but now people of color are determined, and your allies of white people are determined that changes will be made, including in our own public media organizations. So the connection between all of these is that people of color are more affected by all these crises than other people. And I'd like to just quote from Reverend Lennox Yarwood, who is a founder of Hip Hop Coalition. And he said, my activism for racial justice and my activism for climate justice are one and the same. The climate crisis and environmental injustice play out within the same systems of white supremacy and structured racism that are at the roots of police brutality. Communities who are most impacted by police brutality are the same communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. So, you know, this is showing that connection. I'd rather have him point this out. It's more than for me to do it. He does say the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, access healthy and safe food, and live in a safe environment is a civil and human rights struggle of this century. We must get it right for the sake of our children and future generations. And we can get it right if we fight for justice and our climate at the same time.
Thank you, Bill. I want to, as we get into the conversation, dive deeper into the role of community media and draw on some of your experiences working with developing radio partners. But first, I think you've provided, in terms of disproportionate impact on communities of color, another great segue to Julia, to talk, who is coming to us from New Orleans right now, to talk about I see change and what your take on this topic is today. Julia.
Thanks, Sally. I appreciate the intro and I appreciate all of you and your perspectives. Enjoyed the pre-interviews and discussions to date. So I'm Julia Kamara-Drepkin. I'm the CEO and founder of I See Change. We mobilize community stories. That's our roots in public media, going back to KVNF days with Sally, and microdata. And we think of these two things as integral wholes of the human experience, stories and data, to inform local climate adaptation and infrastructure design. And so really kind of zeroing in on the utility aspect of public media, that's very much at the heart of what we do. So right on, Maxi. Eyes on the ground, if you will, that firsthand reporting that any resident can do who is an expert in their own backyard, and also provide that experience and that unequal, that inequitable experience of how our structured environment, the built environment, interacts with the natural environment and the social environment. So we define environment in those three lenses because they're always interacting and creating these structural challenges. So I do have some ideas that I've drawn out as a first draft at what we were asked to talk about, which is kind of creating a lens in which we understand these three crises together. And secondly, what the role of community media is. But I want to hear from Carlos before I throw down some slides. Thanks.
Carlos, give us your view from the trenches.
Yeah, the view from the trenches of the Big Bend region here in Texas. But before I go into that, I just want to say, yeah, thank you, Sally and NFCB for asking me to be on this. And thank you to everyone else who's on this panel. I think what we're seeing right now is specifically at Marfa Public Radio, and I can imagine the same can be said for other rural and small community radio stations throughout the country. I think what we're seeing now is we're at this moment to where we could really prove and provide that utility that Maxi referred to, that useful information, and really just kind of build those connections and those layers of trust with the radio station and the communities that we're here to serve. And so just for example, real quickly, I will say, I think for Marfa Public Radio, we really kind of came into our own as an organization during a massive wildfire that happened back in 2011 here. And so many people throughout the Big Bend region were tuning in because we became a steady, constant source for information. We became a literal lifeline as far as people understanding where the movement of the fire was, where was it being contained, what resources were available at that time. And in a very real sense, I think we found ourselves kind of, I won't say the precipice because I feel like we've been pushed off of it already, but we're already in the middle of a similar moment to where rural radio stations like Marfa Public Radio are here to provide that lifeline information as it relates to the pandemic. And for areas like ourselves, which have seen not as robust testing as we've seen in wider neighborhoods and in more metropolitan areas, the availability for testing that does happen, it becomes important for people to know that. And people are turning to us for information like that. So I think we've found ourselves really at another moment where we are, charged with the task of providing that utility and just community service mindedness that we've set ourselves out for. Yeah.
Carlos, are you guys producing and airing public service type announcements around public safety? And if so, what? How did you come to that, and what is the nature of the content?
Right. I think, certainly I think Marfa Public Radio, we're fortunate enough in that for a radio station of our size, we do have a pretty significant newsroom. So it's about 3 reporters. And so, we have on-air two-ways, features and things of that to fill out our radio space. But there's still so much that is missed between the two news magazines of Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So I think we realized, as a group, that there was stuff that we could do in our interstitial space that would connect people from Morning Edition and the programming in between through All Things Considered, where they would, get those, news from those programs. So we realized that we needed on-air PSAs, and it wasn't just hosts, in the morning and afternoons reading that. It was, pre-recorded 30-second spots that would let people know this is what's happening. This is the next testing available date. You don't have internet, the papers are weekly, but here's that constant reminder of how you can get this information. And so the content is safety guidance. The content is testing information and resources. We've seen a lot of community groups out here come together and form community aid resources. And it's just these PSAs and these 30-second spaces are opportunities for us to kind of further extend that messaging so people could catch it on the off hours that aren't, ME or ATC.
And Maxi, take us to New England Public Media. I know that that's a newer gig for you right now, and a larger organization where Carlos is at Marfa. What is your vision moving forward with this intersectionality, and what's happening now?
Wow. So New England Public Media is a new organization. It's the merger or the alliance of WGBY Public Television and New England Public Radio. So I am the first chief content officer for them. What I'm really trying to do is create an environment that embraces interactivity and a convergence of technology. So I'm looking at how we can create content that marries multiple platforms, that engages our audience live and in an interactive way, taking advantage of social media and digital, and just engaging our audience in a way that I think they're already at, but that our industry probably has lagged in terms of meeting them there. And I'm hoping in doing so that we'll diversify our demographics significantly. What we realize in Western Massachusetts, believe it or not, it's the largest ethnic group is Puerto Rican, and it is the largest block of Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico itself. That's an unusual knowing. I thought it would be New York, but it's not. It's actually West Mass. And so how do we make what we offer more relevant to those communities, recognizing that when it comes to COVID, when it comes to this racialized moment we're in, and even the issues around climate, that they are going to be more impacted because of institutional, structural, and other aspects of inequality and racism, that they're going to be more affected than perhaps the core audience that we have attracted on those two platforms previously. And so how do we not only incorporate their needs, wants, and aspirations in our daily presentation of these issues, but make sure that we're engaged with them so that we're an authentic representation and have the authority to speak on their behalf about how this has impacted them, how these 3 issues bear witness in the region that we serve, and how we're pulling from those specific communities in their great diversity, the intellectual capital, the expertise that is actually dwelling within those communities, whether it be the Puerto Rican community, the Black community, the rural, the urban, the academic institutions that are in the northern part of the region. It's an extremely diverse environment. And so we're just trying to find a way to be more reflective and representative.
Would you say that's going on throughout public media space?
Well, obviously not. Unfortunately, No, it's not. I mean, there's no other way to say it. No, what I mean by that is we're seeing on a regular basis that as much goodwill, and I think there's been good intention in our industry to be more of service to people of color. We've done a piss poor job of actually doing that. And so we're seeing sort of a reckoning in society as a whole, but we're also seeing it within public media, where you're seeing different organizations being called out for practices in their operations that are problematic in terms of retaining people of color as employees, as leadership in those organizations. So that's an issue that we continue to struggle with. I think the kind of structural change that needs to happen is going to be involving some bloodletting. I'm not sure organizations are ready for that because it's not you cannot continue to be this sort of migration. It actually has to be, I would argue, an insurrection, this really strong movement to displace existing towards movement towards where we need to be if we're going to survive as an industry, because 2040, I think it isn't too far off, and we're already witnessing how the browning of America is very tangible and real. And my biggest fear, and I'm sorry to be long-winded here, is that I don't believe we've begun the process of cultivating the reciprocal relationship that public media requires, where we are not only providing content, but we're involved in an engagement that allows us to look at those diverse communities as a resource financially. Where's the membership? Where's the major donorship? Where's the philanthropy that comes from communities of color? We've yet to begin that process.
Thank you. Super compelling to think about that. And I'm wondering, Bill, if you can take us to your work in with developing radio partners, your work with farmers around climate, and in the context of just resource constraints. That is what's very common for people in public media, and yet you've worked in places with far fewer resources, and radio has had a powerful role. So can you give us examples that are inspirational for people listening of what they can do?
Right. We have to go kind of halfway around the world where we find radio as a dominant medium. But it is so highly regarded that in South Africa, for example, with the new government, the first year of the licensing authority was giving licenses. They only licensed community radio stations because they felt they would best serve the interests of a new democracy. And they became the most trustworthy institution. I remember talking to a manager who operated out of a truck container. I asked him what he thought was success. And he said, I learned that there's going to be a school strike, and we stopped it. It had nothing to do with broadcast, it had everything to do with trust. And that's the way it is in many of these stations. In Rwanda, there's a station that has what they call eyewitness monitors. And these are people that are trained in the basic principles of ethics of journalism, but they call in, or in some ways get stories to the main studios about what's going on in their neighborhood. They have 107 of these around the country, and the country is the size of Maryland, so give you some idea of the scope. Then every Saturday they all get together and have a conversation on the air about this. There was another station also in Rwanda that organized 40 live debates in 1 year. They got wind again of some problems and wanted to resolve it quickly, and so that's the way they did that. So, and then in Sierra Leone, it was under a great deal of stress during the Ebola outbreak. The radio stations again played the most important role because they were the most trustworthy source, and they had informed medical people talking about it or on the air, and they became familiar to them. And so I've surveyed them. They're doing a similar thing now with COVID-19, where they sometimes have little plays, they have a lot of PSAs, and doing all the kinds of things that you need to. So I think these are examples. Over there, I think we here, if I may become part of you, feel I'm part of the system here. Because I think we have an opportunity to deal with our strengths of community radio, which are, we've talked about it before, some of the others, but we're grassroots, we're close to our listeners. We do have eyes on the street, excuse me, and if the street needs repair, we talk about it. We're good storytellers, we're trustworthy, and we're small so we can be more creative. And I think the greatest threat to our democracy is public ignorance, because there's so much wrong information. There'll be even more coming down on social media and so on in the coming months. And we have a sacred trust with our listeners to be honest, to be truthful, to present the actual facts and not any of these cockamamie rumors or outright lies. So.
Thank you, Bill. I think it's so inspiring to just look beyond the borders of our country and look at our medium internationally and what can happen, what does happen. And Julia, to come back into the United States, it reminds me of some of your work in New Orleans on the flooding. And your engagement stuff there. And I think one of the things that's really critical for community stations, it's really on their minds, is to all of you have made this point, but elevating our understanding and our community of practice around authentic engagement and reciprocity in the content and the way that it's exchanged. So could you just sketch people so what some of that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So just taking that one step further in terms of being eyes on the street and being close to our communities. I think one of the things that we do at IC Change is that we take it one step further, which is your experience is your trusted experience. But our collective community experience, when you add those stories all together in a structured way, can become more than a story, more than a one-off segment. It becomes this natural power to influence decision-making. And I think I'd like to just go through just a quick framework, and I'm asking your forgiveness and permission that this is a first draft of my ideation on where we're at. And I may get it wrong, and I may make mistakes, but I'm giving that vulnerability up to y'all to walk with me on this one. So just give me a hot second to bring this up. I had a lot to do today, but this was the most exciting thing that I was doing today, was having this talk with y'all. So I have had the honor of being named an Echoing Green Fellow, which is a social impact and entrepreneur and innovator. And coming out of like an event last year, pre-COVID, pre all this madness, one of the advisors for the Elizabeth Warren campaign said, "Hey, Elizabeth Warren doesn't have her climate platform done yet. We're looking for ideas. You got something?" And as a media maker, a journalist, occupying the center space, not being politically active, is kind of my default. But I thought about it and I was like, you know what, I'll give them an hour of my run, which is like my top brain time, right? And I drew something, I squiggled it. I didn't want to take it too seriously, or, I just wanted to get something down. And I came up with something like this. And this was about their Green New Deal. So what would life be like without a Green New Deal versus a Green New Deal? The terrifying thing is I emailed this, which was literally I came home from the run with markers and just did it and then sent it off. And they were like, "This is awesome. This tells everything." And I was like, that is terrifying that you think this is awesome. You should be putting a lot more thought into it. Mm-hmm. But what I realized, fast forward a year later, is that this diagram helps me understand where we're at with COVID. When we swap climate change for COVID, we get similar results, right? And these are structural threats to weak systems. So I tried to redo it, but let me just go back. This is what IC Change does. We create a middle space in between disparate groups, understanding these different changing environments, right? We take community stories and we use community stories to allow disparate groups to talk to each other. These are structural challenges. If you go back to this, these are structural challenges. So you need diverse forms of information from diverse people to truly get at them. So the way we've done it in New Orleans is we've used community stories about flooding to influence multi-million-dollar HUD infrastructure designs. Not just that it's flooding here, but I can't get to the bus. There's trash in my yard and my kid can't play. The postman can't pick up my mail. My doctor and my doctor roommate can't get to the hospital. Those are the community stories, that first person media aspect that is the heart of I See Change still to this day, but we use it differently. We say, okay, this is an ongoing dialogue. We collect every weather event, every crisis, every stress, and then we use that information to inform these structural changes to our neighborhoods and make sure that we have a seat at the table. Because people who are of color, who are stressed by COVID, who are stressed by climate, who are sitting in an unequal table, do not have time to come to community meetings, do not have time to participate civically. So how can we as public media, and I say that, or we as community media, facilitate that engagement and activism, because that is what we do really well, is listen. And I think of infrastructure as this. So when you look at infrastructure, it includes the physical world that we live in, but also the soft things that are creating the structures and moving power and resources around in our communities. Media is an infrastructure, right? It's part of the infrastructure. And it is, how do we engage all these things? And the one thing that is infrastructure that we don't talk about is racism. Racism is its own infrastructure. It channels power. It is a physical thing that you don't see, because infrastructure is the thing that is unseen underneath our society, right? It's the structures that move things around, but we don't really notice them very well. Racism is a part of that, but it is different from equity. Equity is the blocker. So these are a little out of order because I'm new at doing this right now. So this is my new map, and I don't know if it's right. But if you take COVID and climate and these structural stressors, and then you try and solve them, the blocker to solving them is inequity. It amplifies the stress of these things on our systems, and it is a blocker if we don't include it in the solutions. The one thing that I'm really excited about, and I think to Bill's point about what is this crisis moment, what does this mean? A lot of us in climate, we're like, oh God, there's just so much going on. No one's paying attention to climate anymore because we have this inferiority complex. Like, we've been talking about climate for decades and nobody's been listening. But I tell you what, this is it. This is the moment, because if you look at any one solution for climate, equity, and COVID, they intersect so substantially, so significantly, with co-benefits across the three spectrums, if you focus on it properly, if you focus equity as the lensing in which you implement a solution. The work we did in New Orleans that I showed you originally, we were able to increase the capacity of storage for flooding in a community that got the least amount of resources from HUD because of its benefit cost analysis. In other words, if you don't have wealthy property, they're not going to throw a lot of money into protecting your property, right? So we did a great job. Right? I'm really proud of the work that we did. We used public media in a public infrastructure design process. However, I'm not happy entirely, because as we throw resources into that community, it's inevitable that we will have gentrification in that community. And there are no structural ways to solve for that right now. So I'm happy with my results, with our results, but I'm not 100% happy, because if I throw the equity lens and I know there was no, the city we didn't provide a space for those communities to hold on to their properties, if it gets improved, then I'm not going to be 100% proud. So we
Julia, can I just interact? I'm just curious, is there not a way to interact with policy, with planning in a way that would
there is
keep some of that at bay?
I think there is, and I'll get there in a second, but I don't want to hold the audience too long, or the conversation. But I did want to just kind of end with one last thing before I talk about those policy solutions potentially. When it comes to understanding these overwhelming challenges, I think that my answer for anyone on the call who's been asking, like, how do we manage this, is to pick one thing and follow it through, both in equity and climate lens, to make sure we meet people where they are and do the best we can. and to vote for structural changes, regardless of what party it is. Maybe a Republican has a good structural solution. We shouldn't be tribalist about it. But to your point, just in case we had time, I was going to talk about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris last year and AOC came up with a climate equity plan to look at how every federal policy has the equity has an equity rating to it. So at the federal level, if we can reward or somehow quantify equity, then maybe there's a more structural way of handling it. My team found this for me yesterday when I was talking about all these things. So I'm not alone figuring this out, but I think that it's a good example. And I'm gonna stop sharing. There's a lot to it. So
would any of the panelists like to jump in and comment on what we just heard from Julia?
If I can just real quickly, I applaud this notion of the equity, looking at through the equity lens and equity climate in this case. I actually got this job in New England because I outlined the notion of an equity desk and the need to really look at the whole of society. But again, as Julia mentioned, looking at isolated phenomena through that lens as an important work that can be done and likely can be funded as we look for resources so that we can bring more journalism into our facilities, our spaces, our media enterprises. There are a lot of foundations, there are a lot of major donors who would get behind equity desk notions. And so it's something that you should explore in your local area. Are there organizations, funders who would get behind the notion of establishing a desk to specifically look at equity around an issue that matters to your community?
Thank you, Maxi. Carlos, as a reporter, how do you integrate an equity lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think part of the approach is understanding kind of, the heart of this conversation is about looking at inequity as this through line from racism to COVID to a changing climate. And it's important to be mindful that that is kind of the common denominator here that's happening, and that these events aren't happening in isolated instances. So I think, as reporters, we're kind of maybe quick to jump out at a story or idea with just kind of a surface level of understanding of what's immediately in front of us. But, often there are these inequities that if you just spend a little more time, that you become a lot clearer. Specifically, I'm thinking of at least of a more recent story that we've been discussing as of just yesterday in our newsroom, of our reporter who's in the Permian Basin, which is, America's, busiest oil field right now. There's of course flaring that happens there at an obscene amount and rate. And there's also storage of just unsafe chemicals that are really placed near communities of color, communities that because property value isn't to where it's deemed importance, is where they're saying, oh, well, we'll just dump this facility near there because those things aren't of value. And so, on its surface, I think a reporter might look at it and be like, oh, we should find, the study or the whatever that kind of, we're so quick to kind of wanting to maybe look at the numbers of it all, of this is how much was released, this is the health implications, but we really need to kind of take that extra step and look at where it's happening and the people that are directly impacted and affected by it. So I think as a reporter here at Marfa Public Radio, of course, we're looking at these stories as they're unfolding, but of course, this through line of inequity is happening across all of them. So I think the key here is to really I know we're always kind of go, go, go in the newsroom. There's tight deadlines. We want to push things out. But I think if, if your newsroom can allow for it, to give yourself that space and flexibility and freedom to spend time with the story and really dissect it before you're trying to push it out. Because often there's a deeper, nuanced story there that we're missing just because we're trying to rush it, to get it in time for the newscast or to get it in time for whatever slot we have it slated for. And in taking that time, kind of bringing this back to, Bill was mentioning, community trust being a huge part of the cornerstone of rural community stations. That kind of reporting goes to building community trust, because your audience and listeners will see that you've taken the extra step, and will really kind of paint that story of how we're seeing kind of real impact happen within our own backyard and affecting the people that we know and care about. So I think applying that equity lens is crucial, not just for the reporting itself, but also just this building of community trust.
Thank you, Carlos. Well said. All of you are bringing such really important points to the table. And Bill, I want to give you a chance to, give us your take on public media and trust and this moment that we're in. And while you're doing that, Ernesto, if you all could just, if you want to open up your mic and ask a question directly to these panelists, we have about 15 minutes left, and they're generous people with their time, and I'm sure they would be willing to respond to some questions. Just ping Ernesto on chat and we'll make that happen. And I'm really interested in some of your wisdom, Bill, from being in on the public media space from its inception, about this notion of trust and how it relates to the work that lies ahead in these areas.
I think that's our greatest asset, really, is trust. And if that's ever lost, we're done, So that's why accuracy and truth telling is so important. In terms of resources, I just wanted to mention that I'm trying to work on developing a platform that would curate and create pieces, information that could be used by community radio stations about these things, because I know that there are limited resources. And so these could be also acknowledging the interrelatedness between these different crises, which no one else really is doing these days. Just heighten awareness of that, but getting the information there, and also providing a lot of solutions, both that are going on globally and both individually, so that people have hope. Because it's so overwhelming, we need to have hope that things are being done, and this is what I can do, this is what our community can do, that kind of thing. And even also appreciation of nature with songs and poems, writings. And KXE in Grand Rapids, Minnesota has these wonderful postings by listeners of a bird they've just seen or something changing in the seasons. And it's really quite wonderful. Again, appreciating nature that we want to preserve.
Anyway. Our way. KXE, we'll definitely talk to them.
That's
awesome.
That's a beautiful point. And we actually have 3 questions that have come in, and I also want to circle back around before we're finished with your point, Maxi, about interstitial spaces, because I want to see you elaborate on that. But the first question, how do we navigate our identities and investment in our communities while recognizing there is polarization and our stations need to build trust? And whichever one of you would like to kind of give some feedback on that one. Navigating identities, investment in community, but also recognizing this polarization and doing that trust building work.
I can take that, at least with regards to climate. And I think this speaks to kind of the heart of what we did when we developed IC Change at KVNF in a rural station, where half the community didn't believe in Al Gore and worked for the local coal miner companies. So I think that there's trust in authenticity and vulnerability, right?
That's why I sent you out to breakfast.
Yeah, it's so true.
Go eat some bacon.
So we actively, Sally and I, when IC Change started in this town, we got complaints to the ombudsman of CPB that we were brainwashing programming or something like that. And I think that was literally the first conversation she had with me when she picked me up from the airport. How are we going to do this? And what she was so brilliant in her leadership is just that we're getting on air right now. And we're going to talk exactly about our authentic selves, about what our goals are for this. And we invited anyone who did not believe in climate change to still tell us about what they were seeing change in their environment, to celebrate nature and place and our experiences and our differences. And it was actually the ranchers and farmers who didn't believe in climate change who taught us the value of record keeping, to track change, to weather extreme events. And so I think that really just navigating your identities it's not navigating, it's embracing it, embracing difference and embracing the authentic selves and agreeing that we're going to disagree on certain things, but creating that trust and that embracing. And just really finding the common ground is what public media does best. Like we share this space, we share these resources. When things are stressed, we're all feeling it. So actually in this crisis moment, there's that coming together opportunity. And I guess my answer is, embrace where we're at as a means to generate trust and convene. And
I just want to toss in, get real with yourself, get clear in your gut where you're coming from. And also to Carlos, I think maybe you could take this question, but for a station short on the resources to do consistent PSAs around COVID testing, since testing in the region seems to pop up so quickly. This is coming from KKFI, our friends in Kansas City. What would you recommend? What kind of, how would you recommend? They don't have a newsroom.
Right, yeah. And even with the newsroom for ourselves, it's been difficult because testing has dropped. Testing has been announced the day before. So it's become really, even for, a newsroom of 3 people, it has been difficult to stay on top of that. I'm just trying to think of maybe some potential solutions here for this, but as far as a station that's limited on resources and trying to commit to consistent PSAs, I don't know if there's an opportunity to like what that relationship between the station and whoever is announcing these testing opportunities may be, getting more connected with them or just seeing if they're able to maybe come on for an extended interview during the news magazines. But it's really difficult there because again, testing has been so sporadic and kind of a spur of the moment. So I guess my recommendation would just to be, I guess this theme of trust is now coming up and building these relationships, but is to who is the person who is making these announcements, because they're obviously going to be the first kind of person to become aware of. And if there's something that could be worked out there between, that person and the radio station, that could be an easier maybe attempt at approaching or at providing this information. But it certainly is difficult. I will say that. And if I think of a better an idea or an answer, I'll chime back in.
Okay, no, that's great. And Ernesto will probably, take this up with me afterwards, but I do feel like there's a role NFCB needs to begin playing in some of this production side of things for stations on their behalf, because, it just feel like that whole issue of limited resources just stalks us around like toilet paper on your shoe.
Right.
And we need to deal with it. So that's part of our vision. I just want to say that. There's also a compelling question here from our friend Gavin. in Colorado. He says, I have a question about this trust piece. I spoke to a teacher today who said she and her husband have our station KVNF on all day long at their house, but she didn't feel comfortable speaking to me on the record about the controversial back to school plans here. Anyone have suggestions for how to approach engaging with people who think their voices don't belong on public media, or who are scared of speaking to our station for other personal or professional reasons? And this gets super intense in small communities, as all of you have, you know, no doubt imagining or have as a lived experience. But any one of you want to take that one?
I'll just quickly comment on that. I think research I've seen, and I know this goes even way back to 1990s, is that communities learn a lot more when varied perspectives are shared. I think when we get into these rabbit holes of singular thought, we end up becoming less informed. And I think you've seen recent research on Fox and the fact that people who watch Fox News in particular tend to have less knowledge of what's going on in the world than other networks. And I think that's because of a singular focus. And that may be true for MSNBC too, if you believe in all the polarization that exists supposedly in those two spaces. I say that to say that it's important that our media outlets be known as spaces where divergent perspectives and voices are offered, are honored, and even celebrated. I think that a lot of times in community media, there's this notion that there's a specific perspective that our stations have, but I don't know if that's useful as much as it is to provide the varied perspectives. There are facts and then there are perspectives. And I think the more broad the scope of perspectives that you offer on your station, the better.
Thanks. And I want to also say that with community stations, when you have 70, 80, 100 volunteers filing through your station every day, it is imperative in the training of those volunteers that you make it clear that your commitment is to what Maxi's talking about. Because there's a lot of ad-libbing that goes on community radio stations that staffers may not be aware of, that sends a message that people's voices are not welcome there. If there's assumptions about where you are politically or in other ways. One question here for you, Bill. This person says they like the idea of the eyewitnesses that you spoke about. And do you know what types of training criteria would need to be offered for people and where those resources might be available? Could you share them? Maybe you could answer that question. And then we have a final question about predominantly music stations. But first to you, Bill.
I don't know. I don't have access to their training that they had for this, but it's really this kind of basic journalism training for ethics and to make sure that anything they have is accurate and not a rumor or, you know, something like that. So that the worst thing we can do is to start airing the lies that only multiply. Even to deny them, you have to put them out there. So I just think that just a basic training in good journalism and ethics is sufficient for that kind of. Sometimes I've also had a listening post in community where we just go out and talk to people in a mall or something like that. And perhaps once we had the US congressman for the district was there to stand and answer questions. That's the way of being public and accountable and showing that you're engaged and you're not some oddball thing. So I think community concerts, of course, are good, things like that.
Sally, can I get granular real quick on the issue of race?
Please.
I think there needs to be an understanding that there's been a dramatic miseducation of all Americans about race and how it is played in this country. So if we approach it from the standpoint that we all have a lot to learn, that there's been a major misinformation campaign from the very beginning about race, the construct of race, I think that's an important place to start. I'll also bring that into the conversation around COVID. I believe public media is guilty of a cultural bias with respect to looking at solutions around COVID. And that is that we really only honor what the CDC tells us when there are that's a Western modality. If there are Eastern modalities that are, I would argue, viable ways to address the threat of COVID. I'm not saying that they are the vaccine. I'm saying that this is a global pandemic. It's important that we understand that there are global approaches to resolving this pandemic, or to at least addressing wellness and health. And that needs to also be a part of the equation that we present to our communities.
I sure hear that as an alternative healthcare practitioner before I got into public media. It's another fracture line in
Absolutely.
the institution. And so, guys, this is from Nathan Moore, WTJU. He runs a predominantly music station that interweaves short form community stories and other interstitials on a regular basis. But the brand is music. What are some creative, impactful ideas for predominantly music stations? And that, oh, that's Marcellus. It's his voice. I bought his tone. I love it. Okay, sorry. So
that's my boy.
Yeah, it kind of ties into those interstitial spaces you were talking about, creative ways of using them. So if you could quickly give us that, because we're almost at the top of the hour, and then, wow, great discussion.
Yeah, if you know my past, I was part of the launch team for XM Satellite Radio. And when I was part of that, they taught us that there are like 30 different ways that you can do interstitials. These sort of imaging campaigns, if you will, these imaging spots that identify what your station is about, the kind of content that you provide, and just your proximity to the newsmakers, et cetera. I think ESPN is tremendous at doing these. If you've ever watched some of the interstitials, the imaging pieces that they do where athletes are actually interwoven in their work environment, that's an example of imaging. And so when you look at your individual stations in the settings that you may be, what grounds your station to the location, to the local context or flavor of that environment, and finding ways to present yourself as an authentic element within that construct, that community, that culture. If you can find ways to articulate that through audio interstitials, I think you can do a lot to build your brand and create a proximity to your users that will give them the trust and a belief that you are an authentic presenter of that area.
Totally. Local musicians doing PSAs, baby.
Yeah.
Get your mask. If I'm a local musician, you should too.
Yeah.
That was awesome. And also one other thing, I wanted to go back to Nate's question, Gavin's question. There are two issues that that you're representing here in terms of safety versus thinking of I belong or not. Thinking I belong or not is something that the reporter can totally handle. That is a community media messaging. Thinking I'm not safe to have the interview is more of a formal reporter's call as to whether or not there is a harm potentially to that person. And that should probably be in some of the training that we are listed in here. But I would want to make sure that you kind of separate those two things out as separate, that particular person. And then finally, on eyewitnessing, y'all keep asking for stories and Twitters and Instagrams and Facebooks on public media. Don't make the same mistake that private media has made in giving away their broadcasting power onto these platforms. Harness your stories. Your stories are your power.
Amen.
Hear that. That's a beautiful place to leave it. And I want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you always to Ernesto for making all this happen. And rest assured, this is not the last of these conversations. I've already been taking notes, and there's at least 5 or 6 more conversations that spring from this one, which we're going to continue to have. So thank you, everyone. And you know, my hope is for your health and well-being, and that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all. Bye.